Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is part 15 of the Theodore Robert Bundy series, the trial for Kimberly, Diane, Leach. I apologize ahead of time if my microphone is popping like Rice Krispie treats. I know I have to get a new one. Let's start with the copyright disclaimer and the true crime disclaimer. These are true crime videos. They're not made for children and viewer discretion is advised. So where we left off, Ted had been convicted and sentenced for the attack on the victims at Chi Omega. And I want to start off with something that Judge Cowart in the Chi Omega trial had to say. As Bundy and his attorneys stood for the sentencing, the judge was struck by the contrast, because standing next to Bundy were fine young men who went the other way. And he said it was hard to tell the difference. Looking at them, you wonder what it was. There's something that makes people go in a direction other than criminality, Cowart said. Why sentence a man to death, as the judge did, and then urge him to take care of himself? It's something that's commonly discussed, even here on YouTube. Cowart's final parting words to Ted that seems sympathetic to Bundy. And he said, "How can you say you don't have compassion?" said the judge. "I don't want the man to commit suicide. I don't think the man should give up the appellate process. I've sentenced many people. You can't help but feel sorry for them. I'm just not a person that hates. What can I tell you?" I hope that sheds light on what Judge Cowart was thinking when he made those comments to Ted that day. Okay, so remember back on April 7th, 1978, the search for Kim Leach was led by law enforcement, assisted by George Deckel. George Deckel had a direct role in organizing the search for Kim Leach. And these facts I'm going to read to you are taken straight from the appellate brief, this defense's appellate brief. So, April 7th, while part of the search party searched a wooded area near the Suwannee River in Suwannee County, Florida, one of the members of the search party, Florida Highway Patrol Trooper Kenneth Robinson, stumbled upon a tin hog shed. Upon bending down and peering therein, he saw remains of a human body and a pile of clothes. "I see some shoes," Robinson said, peering through a hole in a tin roof. Then he spotted an exposed bone sticking through a pullover jersey and added, "That's not all I see." Fingerprints confirmed that the body was that of Kim Leach. At this point, Ted was already in jail. He had been, as we discussed in the previous episodes, pulled over and then played games with his true identity. And Ted, on August 27th, was charged with 2-count indictment of kidnapping and first-degree murder of Kimberly Diane Leach. So the defense starts preparing for trial. And the defense filed a motion for change of venue from Columbia County because Kim was found in Columbia County. So that's usually where you're going to file your charges, your indictment. And Judge Wallace Jopling, that's the judge on the Leach case, not Cowart. Cowart was only for the Chi Omega attack and killing. Judge Wallace Jopling wanted to attempt to seat a jury in either Sumter or Suwannee before moving it elsewhere. On October 22nd, there was a hearing for the change of venue motion held in Columbia County, and Judge Jopling reserved the ruling pending voir dire. In other words, he wanted to try and talk to the prospective jurors to see if one could be seated there. October 30th, a jury could not be seated near Lake City. There were too many people that knew too much about this case. So venue was tentatively changed to Suwannee, and Ted picked Live Oak because he knew he couldn't get a fair trial in Lake City. Meanwhile, Ted penned a letter to Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth from death row. Stephen and Hugh had met up with Ted through their agent, and Ted wanted to tell his story in a book proclaiming his innocence. However, they wanted to investigate all of the allegations. So they began to do research and spoke to Ted at length to get the truth from him. Note that Ted gave no exculpatory details, in other words, any details that would prove his innocence. Quite the contrary. They ended up with hundreds of hours of audio, some of it quite damning. On November 6th, There was an attempt to pick a jury in Swanee. 27 prospective jurors went through voir dire over 3 days, and the Judge Joplin granted a change of venue. He could not seat a jury in Swanee. And on November 19th, the venue for the trial changed from Swanee to Orange County, Florida. In Orlando, the jury selection took 11 days. 180 prospective jurors were voir dired. The final jury seated ended up being 5 men and 7 women. The trial took 5 weeks. 24 spectators filed into the wood-paneled courtroom in Orange County, Florida, to see Bundy wearing a gray suit and a dark tie and a gold ring on his left hand. He was pale. He bore the pallor of a man who did not see the sun. And throughout the proceedings of voir dire, he was scribbling notes on a legal pad. The tantrums that Bundy threw in Miami did not stop. At one point during the jury selection, Bundy flew into a rage when Judge Joplin reminded him of the jurors' promise to set aside their prejudice. The defense had used all of their 20 peremptory challenges, and the defense was also denied any additional peremptory challenges, and 20 is the most that Florida allows for a death penalty case. So they'd used all their challenges. You have cause challenges. That means someone does something for a cause where everybody can agree, yep, that you're out. You can't be objective. Like someone comes on and says, I totally believe he did it. I believe he should hang. And they can't be objective. They can't hear anything else about it. You can get them off for a cause challenge. Peremptory challenges are the ones you keep essentially in your back pocket and you can just use them. And they use them all up. Usually use them on people essentially that you feel have a bias against your client. Maybe someone's really super pro death penalty or something like that. You have a whole range of reasons to use them. They had 20, they used them up, and Ted was ticked off at the composition of the jury. So by January 18th, Ted had tried twice to stomp out of the trial, and he even squared off with the bailiff. So he lost his composure during the jury selection. He just didn't want to accept the composition of the jury, and he squared off with the judge. He told the judge to use your mind, Your Honor. In other words, implying that these people cannot be fair to me. And Ted had this character up here, Carol Boone, in his corner, and he wrote to her that, quote, Orlando must be a non-event, end quote. Ted determined not to sustain any more physical and mental abuse of the trial. So after jury selection, Ted piped down. He wasn't as animated as he was in the Miami trial, and you'll find out why. Also, it said that Ted had gained some weight from his previous 160 pounds. Note that some spectators had assumed Ted was one of the lawyers. On January 7th, the Leach trial began in Orlando, and all the witnesses were instructed at the trial that no discussions of the defendant's previous convictions would be allowed. Bundy served pro se for much of the trial, but he was also represented by co-counsel Vic Julius Bud was the nickname, Africano, and Lynn Thompson. Co-counsel Lynn Thompson had also represented Ted. He was one of the 4 during the Miami trial, and I don't even think I mentioned him in the last video. So he probably flew under the radar or just didn't tick Ted off. During this trial, Bundy scribbled, he scowled, he passed his counsel pages of yellow notes. And like in the Miami trial, the groupies also sat in the gallery. The Jerry Blair papers that are on the Internet Archive had a note that, quote, the intense adulation of women for Bundy. We had a woman who drove over from Jacksonville every day and sat in the front row, called the Lady in Black, and she almost got into a fight with Carol Boone in Orlando. Representing the state of Florida were Jerry Blair and George Deckel. George Bob Deckel later gave an interview to the Jacksonville Public Library, recalling his time on the case. I believe it's up on the Internet Archive. And he stated that it was, quote, kind of like pulling your fingernails out with a pair of rusty pliers. It was not pleasant. That was a problem for me because Kimberly Leach reminded me of my daughter, end quote. Deckel, unlike many of the other authorities, made a special effort not to know about Bundy's previous crimes in the other states. So he stayed laser focused on the victim, Kimberly Diane Leach. State's Attorney Blair made the opening statements. Also, Deckel went on to write a book. Here's a picture of Ted being transferred to the Leach trial. Kimberly Leach, age 12, was abducted between classes at Lake City Junior High School. February 9th was a cold, rainy morning, and Kim was driven to school by her mother, Frida. In opening statements, the state's attorney outlined the case against Bundy. He talked about it just being another school day, and that Kim had been elected the runner-up in the contest for the Queen of the Valentine's dance that Saturday, and she'd already picked out a white dress that her mother was going to buy her. She went to her homeroom at 8:30 that morning, and after 15 minutes, the bell rang for first period, and Kim went off to her phys ed class, and she accidentally left her denim purse behind. A classmate, Tanny Bonner, was dispatched to get Kim to retrieve her denim purse. So Kim left the auditorium and she returned to get her purse. A passing friend saw her and said congratulations. The friend watched her turn down a hallway, and her friends never saw her again. However, there were some eyewitnesses that will take the stand and talk about what they saw. She was wearing blue denim jeans, a blue football type jersey with 83 on it, 3/4 length fur trimmed coat, white socks, and hush puppy shoes, and she was carrying that denim purse. When she failed to return back to class, she was reported missing that afternoon. The state had a circumstantial evidence case against Bundy. For example, they talked in their opening statements about how she was seen by witness firefighter Andy Anderson. Andy Anderson will go on to talk about how he saw a girl upset and crying being led away by a man, and he had just assumed it was her father. But we'll get into that. The Lake City woman would tell of seeing who she later identified as Bundy erratically driving a white van away from Lake City. The judge ruled that Leslie Parmenter was allowed to describe her encounter on the day before Kim's abduction. Remember from the last video, he was pretending to be Richard Burton of the fire department. The judge ruled that all the other similar transactions between Bundy and victims or potential victims would be kept out. So Leslie, 14, and her brother Danny, 20, testified. And she will talk about how she was in the Kmart parking lot by her school waiting for her brother, and that a man who she ID'd as Ted came up and he was real fidgety. He was digging in his pockets like he didn't know what he was going to say next. And that he asked her if she went to the school across the street. And then she will tell about how Ted was then accosted by her brother who drove up, and that they chased the van and took the license plate number down. And the kids also called a detective right after the incident and reported it. And many witnesses saw Ted at the Lake City Holiday Inn, like the desk clerks, a maid, and so on, and will tell how he bought dinner with one person's credit card, and then he turned around and bought drinks with another person's credit card. Tom Leach, Kim's father, will take the stand and identify the clothing found. In anguish, he will identify the blue football jersey. They say that sometimes he just peeked into the paper bags, his paper evidence bag that held his daughter's clothing. Her mother will testify that she was wearing the hush puppy shoes, the white cotton socks, blue denim jeans, a blue football type jersey pullover shirt with the number 83 on it on the day she dropped her off at school. The firefighter will take the stand and talk about how he was approaching the junior high school when he saw a white van stopped in the westbound lane of Duval Street, and there were two cars backed up behind the van and then his own truck. And as he was waiting for the van to move on, he looked to his left and he saw a young girl about 12 or 13 years old with dark shoulder-length hair parted in the middle, and that the reason that he noticed it was because she looked like one of his nieces. And with this girl, he saw a man approximately in his early 30s with light to dark brown hair. And he saw the man's hair because he said he had a nice full head of hair. And he got the impression that the girl was either crying or had been crying, and the man was scowling, and he thought that the girl had gotten into trouble at school and that her father had come to pick her up. So he noticed this tension. He noticed her dark pullover football jersey, and he thought he remembered either 63 or 83 in red orange on it, and that she was carrying either a pocketbook or a jacket or maybe both, and that this man had her by the left arm around her elbow and was leading her to the white van. He came forward with what he saw 5 months after. The defense will make hay about it because his testimony was then, after he came forward, hypnotically refreshed. They try to say altered. So the firefighter on that day, he'd been working overtime. He saw this crying girl and assumed it was her father, and he didn't come forward until he saw Ted's picture, and then he realized who he had seen that day. So the defense will make a big deal over the fact he waited essentially 6 months to come forward. He takes the stand and says, he didn't think that there was anything going on. He just remembered thinking to himself, Daddy's going to take the little girl home and give her a spanking. So he didn't report what he saw for 6 months because he just didn't want to get involved, and he wasn't sure if it was anything of importance, but then once he saw Ted's face, he realized it was. And then there was Clinch Edenfield, the crossing guard, 71 years old. He had that job for about 6 or 7 years, and he ID'd Bundy as the man he saw driving a white van in front of the junior high school around 8:45. So that would put Ted right around the time that Kim is going to and from the school, the homeroom. And he also testified that he may have seen the van come by once or twice before on that same morning. So it's no shock to us that he was trolling the schools like he liked to do. And Clinch testified that he saw Bundy on television a week or so later, and he recognized him as the man who came through the school zone. However, he didn't report this to police right away. Leslie Parmenter will take the stand and talk about what she saw the day before the abduction. So even before Bundy was arrested, her father, who was a homicide detective, had contacted the Jacksonville Police Department and told them, made a report that his 14-year-old daughter had an encounter with a man in the Kmart shopping center the day before across the street from her school when she was waiting for her brother Danny, and that the man was wearing dark horn-rimmed glasses, a blue navy type uniform jacket with a badge that said Fire Department Richard Burton. And then the license tag number that they wrote down matched the license tag number for the FSU van that was stolen by Ted. Both Danny and Leslie had picked out Bundy from a spread of photos as the man that had accosted her. The defense will make an issue out of the fact that the father agreed to have his children hypnotized after the report, and that each child was asked to separately make a police composite of the man they had seen, and these composites were introduced into evidence at trial. So anytime there's any kind of hypnotically refreshed testimony, it's going to be made into something that maybe it was not refreshed, that it was altered or coerced or whatever. But almost a lot of witnesses back in this time period, after you made the report, they would try to get more out of you, and so they would hypnotize you and just put you into a deep meditative state in order to see if you can remember anything more. That's just basically what it was. A lot of witnesses were hypnotized back in the day. The authorities testified how the FSU van had been located and it was treated like a crime scene. The white van was taken into custody by Officer Wingate of the FSU Police Department, and the FDLE crime lab processed the van for evidence, hair samples, fibers, blood, trace evidence, and the odometer showed that the van had been driven approximately 750 miles, and it was wiped clean of fingerprints. Ted was generally pretty good with wiping things clean of fingerprints. They discovered blood stains in the van, and Richard L. Stevens will testify that the said blood stains In 2 areas of the van were blood type B, which was Kimberly's blood type. Note for the record, DNA was not yet discovered, so this is how we would make matches. We didn't have the detailed DNA information. More circumstantial evidence was in the van. Analyst Mary Hinson will testify that it was extremely probable that both Bundy and Leach's clothing had come in contact with the van's carpet, and that the clothing of each had probably come into contact with each other. Out of thousands of fibers collected, 4 fibers, like the fibers from the carpet, 2 fibers, like the known fibers from Leach's pants or purse, 3 other fibers, like the known fibers from the purse, 1 fiber, like the known fibers from her socks, 1 fiber, like the fibers from Leach's coat collar, 1 strand of fibers, like the fibers from Leach's jersey, 1 fiber, like the fibers from Leach's pullover shirt, 2 fibers, like the fibers from Bundy's sports coat, and 1 fiber, like the fiber from Bundy's shirt. They were all compared, and they tried to determine whether a cross transference had taken place. So essentially, to dumb it down, Ted's coat fibers were found in Kim's socks, jeans, and in the van. And Van's fibers were found on her clothes, fibers from her jeans, and the purse were in the van. So seemingly they all came in contact with each other. Also, where they found her body, there was some clothing, and there was a stain that had Bundy's blood type, we'll call it an ejaculate stain, on that clothing. The state also put on 2 Holiday Inn employees and a handwriting expert, John McCarthy, that showed that Ted was in Lake City, Florida, staying at the Holiday Inn. He was staying under the name Rolf Miller. According to Randy Jones of Brooksville, Ted used the name and credit card of Ralph Miller in order to check in, and that he looked kind of ratty looking, like someone who had been hitchhiking. There was also some impressions, some shoe impressions, I believe, around the hog shed, and I think also in the van, and they were found to, the shoe tracks were found to be the same size, shape, and tread mark as Ted's shoes. After the first day of trial, Ted did a taped interview with Stephen Michaud from the Orange County Jail, and much of the information that Ted told them has also been included in this script and in this series. Ted was becoming edgy at this trial. Coming unglued is what he told Carol Boone. And according to Michaud and Ainsworth, Carol Boone took to bringing elaborate lunches for Bunny, loaded with Valium and vodka and the fruit juice in order to keep him sedated. The jury then heard from the chief medical examiner, Peter Lipkovic, how her body had been found on the left side with her left thigh and knee drawn up and the right leg resting on the left thigh. Her hip and her knee joints were at right angles, and the only clothing on her was the stained turtleneck. The skin of the neck region was absent, and he testified that she did not die of natural causes or accidental causes. And he believed that the day she passed was the day she disappeared from school. However, the jury did not hear the medical examiner's opinion that based on the unnatural position of the body being found on all fours, that it was likely that SA was occurring at the time of her passing. Dr. Richard Stevens, a serologist, testified that blood type B was in the seat of Kim's jeans and the rear of the FSU van, that her panties next to the body also had stains with the O blood secretor type. Bundy's type was also O. Possible, according to the trace evidence, that Kim was attacked, that she was reclothed, and then she was attacked again in that hog pen. And this is how the state case ended. And so it was given over to the defense. Africano had already argued in opening statements that Bundy did not dispute that he was in Lake City. So they were go ahead and they were agreeing that he was at the Holiday Inn. He was at the Holiday Inn that night, actually, and he was using stolen credit cards. And when you don't have anything else, what you do is you argue reasonable doubt, and that's what Africano argued, reasonable doubt. The defense claimed Ted was a victim of circumstance, but Africano told the jury that Bundy didn't dispute that he was in Lake City, that he didn't dispute he was using stolen credit cards, but that he was not the person who harmed Kim. And basically what they did was just picket every single witness. If a witness was hypnotized, even after they did a full report before the hypnotism, they would say that the testimony was enhanced or changed somehow. They would criticize witnesses not coming forward the same day, that they waited 5 months until they saw them on TV. They would just pick at every little bit of evidence, pick at the fibers, pick at the blood, pick at everything, and then just try to create some kind of a reasonable doubt. Bundy called the state's evidence flimsy and riddled with inconsistencies. He said, quote, "I cannot imagine that a court or any other individual would find me guilty of murder in the first degree." This is what he told the judge in chambers before the defense had started. And they said they didn't know how Kim died. They really went in for anybody that had been hypnotized, and the state will end up presenting rebuttal evidence, rebuttal witnesses regarding the hypnosis. And again, the hypnosis will go up as an issue for appeal later on. So to compare, the state put on 65 witnesses against Ted with a lot of circumstantial evidence, the fiber evidence, the blood evidence, the eyewitnesses, hypnotized and unhypnotized. And then the defense put on 27 witnesses, and they pretty much just picked at the evidence that the state had presented. And then it went to the jury. And what was Ted thinking about? Well, Ted and Carol on February 6, 1980, applied for a marriage license in Orlando, and they wanted to be married after the trial was over, but Major Schultz of the county jail had rejected the request. So Bundy signed the marriage license while they were at the courthouse, and Carol Boone hot-footed it upstairs and had it registered. That was what was on Ted's mind, keeping Carol happy. Then it was time for closing arguments. Bob Deckel took the first shot at Ted, and he characterized the former law student as a cold, calculating killer. Quote, "From the 1st of January on through February, he used his apartment at the Oaks as a base of operations for a little expedition that I guess you could best characterize as a hunting trip." The state talked about how he had approached Leslie Parmenter the day before, and he was foiled when her brother drove up and scared him off, and that the next day he checks out of the Lake City Holiday Inn. He's all clean-shaven. He's looking for another victim, another place to strike, another person to strike out at. The state puts Ted in Lake City with the receipts, with the eyewitnesses, with the crossing guard, with the firefighter, and later on with the van, with the evidence found in the van, with the fibers, with the shoe impressions, with the blood typing. All of this goes to prove that Ted was the one that abducted Kim. On February 7th, 1980, the jury found Ted guilty of the kidnapping and the murder of Kim Leach. They deliberated for 7 hours and found him guilty of first-degree murder. Kim Leach's father said, "Let me pull the switch," but they still had to go into the second phase of his trial. That's the sentencing phase. But what was on Ted's mind? Well, I'll let you know, because you can call witnesses in your sentencing phase. You especially want to call character witnesses, mitigating witnesses. You could call people to prove that you had a horrible childhood and the like, because they've already found you guilty, so now you want to mitigate. And guess who he called? Carol Ann Boone. Ted called one defense witness who had been putting pressure on him to get married. And this plan was her idea. He called Carol as a character witness, and he marries her on the stand. I mean, can you imagine marrying a woman while you are facing the death penalty for the abduction and murder of an innocent 12-year-old girl? Can you imagine that? Ted had already pitched one fit because a notary had refused to do the nuptial, so this was their workaround. Can you believe it? I mean, who says true romance is dead? I mean, perhaps he thought he'd soften the jury up. You know, how can you issue a writ of execution for me on my wedding day? So a notary sat in the back row and signed the marriage license after their ham-handed, I think it was 3 attempts, and finally the 4th one, he got the proper wording out that, you know, you want to marry me, I want to marry you type stuff. It's all over the internet, the actual video footage of this chaos. But yeah, that was what was on his mind. So this is Mrs. Carol Bundy, who totally believed in Ted's innocence, and even people like Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth did not tell her the details they discovered through talking with Ted and recording him because of her staunch belief in Ted. So this act of getting married starts the Bundy Boone family. However, this bit of theater did not soften the jury up. After 10 minutes, they came back and advised for the death penalty. At this time, Florida had a split decision, with the jury making a recommendation on sentencing, and then the judge would finalize it. Ted threw a fit. He turned with his back to the judge, and when he turned back around, he said, "You let the jury know they got it wrong." So the jury came back for the death penalty. They were polled by the judge, and the sentencing was set for February 12th. This is when the trial judge is going to make his final determination, whether he's going to uphold their sentencing or not. The trial judge agreed with the jury's sentencing. He found both aggravating and mitigating factors. He ended up giving Ted life for the kidnapping and death for the murder. So he said that the court found the kidnapping was indeed heinous, atrocious, and cruel, in that it was extremely wicked, shockingly evil, vile, and with utter indifference to human life. And that's how Ted was sentenced to death in Florida for the murder of Kim Leach. And this is how he ended up being executed in Florida. Ted blamed the verdict on pretrial publicity. After all, the Chi Omega murders, that trial had been publicized, televised from Miami. So he believed that he couldn't get a fair trial in Florida. And after his conviction for the murder of Kim Leach, he was housed in the Florida State Prison at Stark, and he was protected there. The death row inmates don't mingle with the general population. The Leach case went up for appeal, and the Florida Supreme Court affirmed his conviction and his sentence. As it turned out, the Chi Omega cases had some appellate issues that the Leach case simply didn't have. And that is why the Leach case was the one that ended up executing Ted Bundy. On August 17, 1980, Bundy's longtime friend and acquaintance Ann Rule penned The Stranger Beside Me, and it was published. It did very well. Most people have read it. If you follow the Ted Bundy cases, a lot of people have read that. It was their first Ted Bundy book, but at least it was published after both the Chi Omega and the Leach convictions. So you can at least say that that came out after the fact. On a side note, it was June 1981, and Orange County, Florida was pissed off because the county had to wait to be reimbursed for the change of venue expenses associated with the Leach trial. I mean, this county has more money than Columbia County, but at that time in 81, $42,000 essentially was the cost that Orange County incurred, and Columbia County just didn't pay it. So finally, after complaint, Judge Doppling issued a court order for Columbia to pay up, and they did. It just turned out that Columbia was the one that had the costs because that's where Kim's body had been found. But yeah, Orange County didn't get paid right away, and they had to squeal to get paid. So in the final episode, we are going to wrap everything up from soup to nuts. We're going to talk about Ted's life on death row, fathering a child with Carol Boone, with his own DNA, yes, right? His confessions, his feeble attempts to prolong his existence here on Earth, and then finally his execution. If you found this video informative and you want to be notified of the final episode, hit that subscribe bell, hit the like button, and I will see you for part 16, and let's wrap up this series. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Again, I'm sorry when the mic is popping. I need to get a new one, and we're still recovering from the hurricane. So I really appreciate all your support and prayers. And without further ado, have an excellent day. Bye.